The Untold Story: How the Yom Kippur War Changed the Middle East Forever. The Yom Kippur War, which erupted on October 6, 1973, stands as one of the most significant and transformative conflicts in the history of the Middle East. This war, fought between Israel and a coalition of Arab states, led by Egypt and Syria, was far more than just a military engagement. It was a geopolitical earthquake that reshaped the balance of power in the region, redefined national boundaries, and set the stage for future conflicts and peace efforts. While many are familiar with the broad strokes of this conflict, the intricacies of why it happened, how it unfolded, and its long-term consequences are often overlooked. The Yom Kippur War was not just a battle for territory. It was a battle for pride, recognition, and a new order in the Middle East. To fully understand the Yom Kippur War, it is essential to examine the historical context that led up to it. The roots of the conflict can be traced back to the dissolution of the Ottoman Empire after World War I, which resulted in the establishment of the modern states of the Middle East. The British Mandate of Palestine, created in 1920, was a particularly contentious region. The Balfour Declaration of 1917 had promised the establishment of a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine, a region with a significant Arab population. This declaration set the stage for decades of tension between Jews and Arabs in the region. The situation escalated dramatically after World War II, particularly with the Holocaust driving a massive influx of Jewish immigrants to Palestine. The United Nations proposed a partition plan in 1947 to create separate Jewish and Arab states, but this plan was rejected by the Arab states, leading to the First Arab-Israeli War in 1948. Israel's victory in this war established its independence, but also sowed the seeds of deep-seated animosity among its Arab neighbors, particularly those who had lost territory and faced an influx of Palestinian refugees. The subsequent wars between Israel and its neighbors, most notably the Suez Crisis in 1956 and the Six-Day War in 1967, further solidified Israel's position as a dominant military power in the region. The Six-Day War was particularly impactful, as Israel captured the Sinai Peninsula from Egypt, the Golan Heights from Syria, the West Bank from Jordan, and East Jerusalem, significantly altering the geopolitical landscape. The Arab states, humiliated and weakened by these losses, were left with a deep sense of resentment and a desire for revenge. The stage was set for another major conflict, one that would come to be known as the Yom Kippur War. By 1973, Egypt and Syria were determined to reverse the humiliations of 1967 and regain the territories they had lost. For Egypt, the loss of the Sinai Peninsula was not just a territorial issue, but a blow to national pride and a threat to its strategic security. For Syria, the Golan Heights, a vital high ground overlooking Israeli territory, was a critical loss. Both countries began preparing for a new war, determined to catch Israel off guard and force a change in the status quo. One of the most remarkable aspects of the Yom Kippur War was the level of secrecy and deception that the Egyptians and Syrians were able to maintain in the lead-up to the conflict. Despite some intelligence warnings, Israel was caught by surprise when the war began. The Egyptian and Syrian armies launched their coordinated assault on Yom Kippur, the holiest day in the Jewish calendar, when Israel was least prepared for an attack. The choice of this day was a strategic masterstroke, taking advantage of the fact that much of the Israeli military and population were engaged in religious observances, making mobilization slower and more difficult. In the early hours of October, an Israeli political and military leaders received shocking news. A joint Egyptian and Syrian attack was imminent, despite his warning. The Israeli army was not fully mobilized, and many of its forces were still in reserve. At 2 p.m., the Egyptian and Syrian forces launched their attacks on the Sinai Peninsula and the Golan Heights, respectively. The initial success of these attacks was staggering. The Egyptian forces quickly breached the Bar-Lev line, Israel's heavily fortified defensive line along the Suez Canal, and established bridgeheads on the eastern bank. Meanwhile, Syrian forces advanced rapidly on the Golan Heights, pushing back the Israeli defenders. The early stages of the war were a triumph for the Arab forces. The element of surprise, combined with meticulous planning and preparation, allowed Egypt and Syria to achieve significant gains. For the first time since 1948, the Arab states had managed to launch a coordinated and effective military operation against Israel. This early success shattered the myth of Israeli invincibility that had been built up since the Six-Day War and restored a sense of pride and confidence to the Arab world. However, the initial success of the Arab forces was not enough to secure a decisive victory. Israel, though caught off guard, quickly mobilized its reserves and began to regroup. The Israeli Defense Forces, IDF, launched a series of counterattacks that gradually turned the tide of the war. In the Sinai, Israeli forces, under the command of General Ariel Sharon, launched a daring counteroffensive that crossed the Suez Canal and encircled the Egyptian Third Army. In the Golan Heights, Israeli forces pushed back the Syrians and even advanced into Syrian territory. Despite these Israeli successes, the war had already achieved its primary objectives for Egypt and Syria. The initial gains made by the Arab forces, combined with the heavy losses inflicted on the IDF, forced Israel to reconsider its position in the region. The war demonstrated that Israel was not invulnerable and that the Arab states could mount a credible military challenge. This realization paved the way for the diplomatic efforts that followed. The Yom Kippur War also had significant international ramifications. The Soviet Union, which had provided substantial military support to Egypt and Syria, was deeply involved in the conflict, as was the United States, which supported Israel. The war brought the two superpowers to the brink of direct confrontation, particularly when the Soviet Union threatened to intervene militarily on behalf of Egypt. The United States responded by placing its nuclear forces on high alert, leading to one of the tensest moments of the Cold War. The war also led to a dramatic shift in global energy politics. In response to US support for Israel, the Arab members of the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, OPEC, declared an oil embargo against the United States and other Western countries. This embargo led to a massive increase in oil prices and triggered an energy crisis that had profound economic and political consequences around the world. The oil embargo also highlighted the strategic importance of the Middle East and underscored the need for a more balanced and diplomatic approach to the region's conflicts. In the aftermath of the war, the geopolitical landscape of the Middle East was irrevocably altered. The war exposed the vulnerabilities of all the parties involved and demonstrated the limits of military power in achieving long-term political objectives. For Israel, the war was a sobering reminder that its security could not be guaranteed solely through military strength. The heavy losses suffered by the IDF and the initial successes of the Arab forces shattered the complacency that had set in after the Six-Day War. For Egypt, the war was both a military defeat and a political victory. While the Egyptian army ultimately failed to achieve its objectives, the war restored a sense of national pride and demonstrated Egypt's ability to challenge Israel on the battlefield. This newfound confidence enabled Egyptian President Anwar Sadat to pursue a bold and unprecedented course of action in the years following the war. In 1977, Sadat made a historic visit to Jerusalem, signaling his willingness to negotiate directly with Israel. This visit paved the way for the Camp David Accords in 1978, which led to the signing of a peace treaty between Egypt and Israel in 1979. This treaty marked the first time an Arab state recognized Israel and established formal diplomatic relations, fundamentally altering the political dynamics of the Middle East. The Yom Kippur War also had a profound impact on Syria. Unlike Egypt, Syria did not achieve its military objectives during the war, and its attempts to reclaim the Golan Heights were ultimately unsuccessful. However, the war reinforced Syria's position as a key player in the Arab-Israeli conflict and solidified its alliance with the Soviet Union. The war also deepened Syria's commitment to a confrontational stance against Israel, which would continue to shape its foreign policy for decades to come. The legacy of the Yom Kippur War extends far beyond the immediate outcomes of the conflict. The war demonstrated the limitations of military force in resolving deeply entrenched political and territorial disputes. It highlighted the importance of diplomacy and negotiation in achieving lasting peace in the region. The war also underscored the interconnectedness of global politics, as the conflict had far-reaching implications for the Cold War, global energy markets, and international relations. In the years following the war, the Middle East witnessed significant changes in the balance of power. Egypt, once a leader of the Arab world in its opposition to Israel, shifted its focus toward peace and economic development. The Camp David Accords and the subsequent peace treaty with Israel were milestones in this process, but they also led to Egypt's temporary isolation from the Arab world, as many Arab states viewed Sadat's actions as a betrayal of the Palestinian cause. For Israel, the war prompted a reassessment of its security strategy and its approach to the Arab-Israeli conflict. The heavy casualties and the initial setbacks during the war led to greater emphasis on intelligence, early warning systems, and the need for a more flexible and responsive military strategy. The war also led to increased political polarization within Israel, as debates over the conduct of the war and the broader peace process intensified. The Yom Kippur War also left a lasting impact on the Palestinian national movement. The war highlighted the centrality of the Palestinian issue in the Arab-Israeli conflict, and it underscored the need for a political solution that addressed the aspirations of the Palestinian people. The war also contributed to the rise of more radical elements within the Palestinian movement, as frustration with the lack of progress in achieving a Palestinian state led to the emergence of groups like the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, PFLP, and other militant factions. The Yom Kippur War was not just a military conflict. It was a turning point in the history of the Middle East. The war reshaped the political landscape of the region, brought the superpowers to the brink of confrontation, and triggered a global energy crisis. It also paved the way for significant diplomatic breakthroughs, most notably the peace treaty between Egypt and Israel. However, the war also left unresolved the deep-rooted political and territorial disputes that continue to fuel tensions in the region to this day. As we look back on the Yom Kippur War, it is clear that this conflict was a watershed moment in the history of the Middle East. The war demonstrated the complex interplay between military power, diplomacy, and global politics. It highlighted the enduring challenges of achieving peace and stability in a region marked by deep-seated rivalries and historical grievances, and it serves as a reminder that the legacy of the Yom Kippur War continues to shape the Middle East and the world in profound and lasting ways.